So I guess it's time to start. So welcome everyone to the third day of the conference. It's my pleasure to welcome Jacob Stegenga here in Prague virtually, joining us, of course, as everyone else. And so I gave some introduction to Jacob yesterday, but let me just say a few words again for those of you who don't know Jacob. So Jacob is from the Department of History and Philosophy of Science of the University of Cambridge. He is probably best known for his work on the effectiveness of medical interventions, which he has been publishing on for several years, and his work was finally summarized in his 2018 book called Medical Nihilism, which was published by the Oxford University Press. He's also the author of an introductory textbook to philosophy of medicine called Care and Cure. And recently, his work concerns the sciences of sexual desire. And if I'm not mistaken, he is also working on a book on this topic, and he will give his keynote talk precisely on this. So Jacob, please, if you can share your presentation with us and start, it would be great. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, let me get this set up here. Okay. Martin, how's that? Is that okay?
Yeah, so now it's perfect.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks for including me in this conference. It's a pleasure. So thank you very much, Martin. As Martin noted, I'm currently writing a book on the sciences of sexual desire. This is one chapter from that book on the medicalization of sexual desire. This picture here is a picture of a relatively new drug, which is marketed for female sexual dysfunction, or the current disease category is female sexual interest arousal disorder. This is one disease category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and that's going to be the focus of this talk. Female sexual interest arousal disorder. So very, very broadly construed, psychiatry conceives of two basic ways in which our sexual desires can go awry. One is desiring objects or activities that we ought not desire. So these are the paraphilias. So for example, like pedophilia or necrophilia. And then the other broad category is not desiring things that we are putatively supposed to desire. And that's essentially deemed low libido. So there's a male version of low libido and a female version of low libido in the current edition of the DSM. So the sexual dysfunctions have always been extremely controversial, and arguably the low libido sexual dysfunctions are among the most controversial disease categories in psychiatry today. Here's the description of the female version of the low libido disease. So to be diagnosed with this, a patient has to have at least 3 of the top 6 symptoms, and the patient has to experience distress from those symptoms. So all of these symptoms are essentially about not having enough interest or pleasure in sexual activity. So if a patient has at least 3 of the following 6, and those symptoms cause distress, then the patient can be diagnosed with female sexual interest arousal disorder. Sometimes in the literature and sometimes in my talk, this will just be abbreviated as FSD, like female sexual dysfunction. But that implies like a very particular kind of sexual dysfunction, namely this like low interest disease. Okay, so sexual interest, sexual desire has long been theorized by like different kinds of scholars. So for example, Kinsey conceived of differing strengths of sexual desire in physiological terms. So he understood that, or he postulated that people varied widely in their physiological capacities and physiological interests, and that included interest or desire in sexual activity. And so for Kinsey, the variation in population level variation in libido was just a result of variation in some underlying physiological capacity, a bit like variation in athletic prowess. So he said, and this was in opposition to like the trendy theory at the time, namely like Freudian psychoanalysis, which held that variation in libido was a result of some form of like psychological repression. The picture on the right is the feminist legal scholar Catherine McKinnon, who conceives of female sexuality in social and political terms. So for McKinnon, we ought not conceive of variation in libido purely in physiological terms, but rather we ought to take into account females' broader like social context, including economic inequality, fears about violence, and to conceive of female sexual dysfunction without taking into account those features is excessively reductionistic, according to McKinnon. So these sorts of theories, like the kind of Kinsey style and McKinnon style, have been around a long time, and they form the basis of what I take to be the two main positions on female sexual dysfunction today. So I'm articulating these two positions as what I'm calling the mainstream view and the critical view. So the mainstream view about female sexual dysfunction is just the status quo as held by psychiatry, many patient advocacy groups, many journalists and cultural commentators on sexuality, which basically holds the Kinsey view, which basically says variation in sexual interest and sexual desire is the result of some sort of underlying biological process, and so normal sexual desire is a result of like normal biological functioning, and low sexual desire is a result of some sort of dysfunction in biology, and we ought to be diagnosing such cases and intervening using some kind of pharmaceutical. That's the mainstream view, and it is mainstream in many respects. So that way of thinking is like codified into the DSM. There are surveys of like professional medical groups, like say gynecologists or psychiatrists, that ask, do you think that FSD is a real disease? And something like 85% of medical practitioners in those medical subdisciplines indeed say that FSD is a genuine disease. The other view, the view that I'm calling the critical view, is also held by like a wide range of scholars, journalists, and patient advocacy groups and activists. And the critical view says FSD is not a disease. FSD is a result of females' social and cultural and political context. And so we ought not conceive of FSD in terms of some sort of underlying biological dysfunction. Okay, so, right. The mainstream view is codified in the DSM. Very prominent medical scientists and medical commentators, like such as Irwin Goldstein. Irwin Goldstein is a very famous urologist. The Berman sisters, who like had their own TV show. These very famous medical commentators have been arguing that FSD is a genuine disease and we ought to be treating it using either testosterone or some kind of pharmaceutical. So we'll read things like, quote, sexual desire is considered the result of a complex balance between inhibitory and excitatory pathways in the brain, for example, dopamine, estrogen, progesterone, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Goldstein, I'm going to come back to Goldstein in a couple places throughout the talk, but Goldstein is arguably like the kind of poster child for considering FSD as a genuine disease. And he argues that, right, there's such joy in treating these people successfully. And we're going to see why this claim is at least ironic in a few moments. The critical view, again, is held by a wide range of scholars. The psychologist Leonore Tiefer is probably the most vocal of these. So Tiefer organized this campaign called the New View campaign. And adherents to this include like well-known journalists such as Ray Moynihan, John Bancroft, who was the former director of the Kinsey Institute. Some very prominent figures argued that FSD is not a genuine disease. It's an instance of disease mongering, trying to sell sickness to people. And to conceive of FSD as a disease comes along with all sorts of harms, like reifying the category and distracting people from the real causes of sexual dysfunctions. So Tiefer argues that the creation and promotion of FSD is a textbook case of disease mongering. So we have these two views, the mainstream view and the critical view. And what I'm going to do in the first half of the talk is just walk through the key arguments on both sides. So the mainstream view has four key arguments that I identify, what I call the argument from suffering, the appetitive argument, the argument from female equality, and the argument from treatment success. And the critical view has a few arguments that I identify: the spurious disease argument, the construction of distress argument, the argument from treatment failure, the conflict of interest argument, and the harms argument. So this famous urologist, Irwin Goldstein, when he was asked about the nefarious consequences of the medicalization of female sexual desire, he said, look, this is not a problem for me. This is a problem. This is a question for some philosopher. That's a quote from Goldstein. So I took this as an invitation, and I am asking, among these arguments, are there any compelling arguments? And which of these views, the mainstream view or the critical view, ought we align ourselves with? Now, the punchline here in the talk is that most of the arguments for the mainstream view are uncompelling. But also, most of the arguments for the critical view are uncompelling as well. And yet, the balance of arguments, I think, modestly favors the critical view. So we'll get there. So first, the argument from suffering, it's pretty simple. The argument from suffering just notes that a really widespread problem among females today is low sexual desire. The most common complaint among sex therapists is low sexual desire, both from males and from females. And if we believe some statistics, the problem is extremely widespread. And so that suggests to some defenders of the mainstream view that medicine ought to be helping. So now, of course, while any form of suffering warrants sympathy, as an argument for the mainstream view, it's question-begging, of course, because it assumes as a premise that low female sexual desire ought to be in the domain of medicine, which is exactly the issue, which is under dispute. So, of course, not all forms of suffering are in the domain of medicine. You would just think of, the suffering that's caused by hunger, for example, or the suffering that's caused by climbing a tall mountain or listening to country music. They're all sorts of forms of suffering that is caused by a particular condition, and yet we don't think that condition or that activity or that state is properly in the domain of medicine. And moreover, there's a more nuanced issue with this argument as well, and we're going to see this in a few minutes. What critics say is that the particular form of suffering that is a result of FSD is not an intrinsic feature, or at least in most cases, is not an intrinsic feature of the condition itself, but rather is a result of the social context in which a female finds herself. In short, this is a kind of foreshadowing of the construction of distress argument for the critical view. Okay, the appetitive argument, we saw this already foreshadowed by Kinsey. This basically says that that low female sexual desire is a result of low levels of particular hormones or neurotransmitters, and so sexual desire is a bit like an appetite, or just is like an appetite, and departures from normal functioning of that appetite are a result of underlying physiological causes, and therefore we ought to be targeting those underlying physiological causes. So we do have, of course, some empirical evidence that suggests that modulating some physiological states can have influences on sexual desire. So we know, for example, that a side effect of many antidepressants is the dampening of sexual desire. And so that itself is some evidence that there's an underlying biological basis for both normal sexual desire and for departures from the norm. But that's hardly an argument for the mainstream view, because we know that there are all sorts of normal, like, human conditions for which there's an underlying physiological capacity, like athletic prowess, for example. So one's running speed is, of course, a function not only of how much training you've done, but also of your some kind of underlying intrinsic physiological capacity. But if you have a slow running speed, that doesn't mean and that slow running speed might be a result of some unusually low intrinsic physiological capacity, but that doesn't entail that running, like a slow running, is a disease. So the appetitive argument is unconvincing. Now, maybe taken together, the appetitive argument and the argument from suffering, if we take these two together, so like basically there is some underlying biological basis for low sexual desire, and low sexual desire causes distress or some kind of suffering, then maybe those two arguments taken together provide some warrant for the mainstream view. But there too, I think that the warrant is pretty thin. So just take like hunger, for example, is a compelling analogy. So we know that hunger has an underlying biological basis, and we know that hunger causes suffering, but that doesn't mean that hunger is properly in the domain of medicine. Okay, the argument from female equality is pretty straightforward. It says that a lot of research on sexuality has been focused on male sexuality, and as a matter of fact, there's been wildly successful interventions for male sexuality starting in the 1990s, like Viagra. And so patient advocacy groups raise these issues as an argument for not only promoting more research on female sexuality, but in fact, arguing that the disease category FSD is a genuine disease category, and moreover, arguing that new drugs that are under review by regulators ought to be approved on grounds that, like, males have their drugs, we should have our drug too. In fact, there was a patient advocacy campaign for the first non-testosterone-based pharmaceutical for female sexual dysfunction. This drug was called flibanserin. The patient advocacy campaign was called Even the Score. So they're even just kind of building in this idea from female equality, like, into the name of the campaign. Now, this argument also has damning problems. So one is just that it assumes that male sexual desire is itself something that ought to be in the domain of medicine, and that's something that critics have also argued against. But it's also hard to see how it's supposed to apply in the context of, like, actual medicine today. So it's true that for male sexual dysfunction, there are, like, if we're speaking about erectile dysfunction, that there have been some blockbuster drugs. But what critics have argued is that it's hard to see what the equivalent would be for females. Okay. The argument from treatment success. So sometimes champions such as Goldstein will argue that given that we can treat females with low libido, we can do it pretty well, we might as well do it. That's an argument in favor of the condition being in the domain of medicine. And sometimes this argument is articulated in just like laughably hyperbolic terms. So, for example, Goldstein was being interviewed by a journalist about the process of getting FDA regulatory approval for this drug, flubencerin. And so he was asked about his experience in consulting for the company that was bringing the drug to market. And he said, when we were going to the FDA, our worry was that the drug would be perceived as enhancing female sexual desire too much. He said, this is a quote, they were concerned that the drug would be turning women into nymphomaniacs. These were his words. And actually, the empirical evidence suggests that this drug is so far from that. The best empirical evidence on which the FDA was making its judgment suggested that the drug had extremely minimal impact on sexual interest and sexual arousal, sexual desire. So the argument from treatment success looks like it's excessively optimistic. Okay, the critical view, the primary argument for the critical view is what I'm calling the spurious disease argument. I'm going to get into it a bit here and then in a bit more nuance in the latter few minutes of the talk. So the short view of this argument is just that female sexual desire, like female sexual dysfunction, is just not a genuine disease. It's not something that arises as a result of dysfunctional biology, but rather low sexual desire is a result of all sorts of social and cultural and political features of a female's context. So, for example, one might have low sexual desire as a result of being in a stressful relationship or an abusive relationship, or just being tired at the end of the day. What some people have argued is just low sexual desire is just a result of long-term monogamy. And so that's the critical line, is that the causes of low sexual desire aren't biological, but rather they're social. Now, actually, one version of this argument I find extremely interesting. So Lori Brotto was the psychologist who chaired the DSM committee which was tasked with the redevelopment of the sexual dysfunction disease categories. So she's like the boss of this chapter in the DSM that wrote the disease category, female sexual interest arousal disorder. And she's also a therapist. And she was interviewed by a journalist. The journalist was asking about like what her typical patient is like. And she, in a kind of like offhand way, said, quote, sometimes I wonder whether it, namely token instances of FSD, whether it isn't so much about libido as it is about boredom in the result of like long-term monogamy. This is like the chair of the DSM committee who like wrote this disease category, making that claim. Now, so is this argument compelling? It is arguably the most important, it's the most important argument for the critical view. Now, if it's taken to be a thesis about token instances of low female sexual desire, then surely it's convincing. Surely it's plausible that for some females diagnosed with FSD, their condition is better understood as arising from some social context rather than from some intrinsic physiological capacity, surely. But if this argument is meant as a thesis about the disease category itself, like as a kind, as a type, rather than as a collection of tokens, then it's less convincing, because it would amount to denying that there's any particular token instance of low female sexual desire, which is a result of a disease. So, and that I think is implausible. And the reason why I think it's implausible is just considering what any of the like general philosophical theories of disease would say about this putative disease, or like a token instance of this putative disease. So for example, normativism about disease would just have a straightforward case here. So if we stipulate that some particular female is suffering distress from this collection of symptoms, then normativism is committed to saying that it's a disease. And at the very least, if we take like a Cooper-style normativism, which says, and it's medically treatable. So to deny that a token instance, like that all token instances are diseases, would amount to denying that there's not a single female in the world for whom they're suffering distress from their symptoms and some medical intervention can help. And that seems to me implausible. And I think you can build the same sort of argument for like any of the general theories of disease, naturalism, hybridism, and so on. Okay. There's a lot more nuance to this argument, but for sake of time, I'm just going to have to sort of fly through. But in short, what I think is compelling when we consider this argument is that as an argument about some tokens, it's compelling. As an argument about the type, the disease category, it's not so compelling. Okay, the construction of distress argument. So remember, like the definition of the disease required that a patient experience distress, some kind of harm. And so that seems like a reasonable requirement. I mean, the symptoms alone aren't pathological. There are many people who claim to be asexual and they claim to not suffer any problem from their condition. It's hard to see why we would want to pathologize that condition. So it seems like the sort of pathological element of FSD has got to be built into the distress component of the disease. But what critics say is that distress is constructed from a female's social context. So that might be a result of feeling like you're not living up to social norms, or simply having an imbalance in a romantic relationship, or feeling like, the social forces that arise from peers or advertising or pornography or whatever, you're not living up to this, some kind of like standard of what it means to be a sexually active person, and therefore you suffer from some sort of distress. And of course, like the vast majority of cases of FSD arise among like heterosexual women in which their strength of desire is like relative to the strength of their partner's desire. And so arguably the distress is not an intrinsic feature, at least in many cases, is not an intrinsic feature of the person, but rather is a relational feature between the person and their social context, including their romantic relationship. One just kind of interesting side note here is that the DSM itself has a really curious proviso to the description of FSD. So they note, for example, that, quote, a judgment about whether low sexual desire reported by women from a certain ethnocultural group meets criteria for FSD must take into account the fact that different cultures may pathologize some behaviors and not others. Now that's on its face kind of puzzling. I mean, we don't, like, medicine doesn't do that in sort of any other like subdiscipline of medicine. We don't think that, type 1 diabetes is indeed a disease in this culture, but not in that culture. So it looks like the DSM is explicitly committed to this sort of cultural relativism in which FSD is pathologized in some culture and not in other cultures. And that's strange because we might just say that the problem is with the act of pathologization rather than the intrinsic features of the condition itself. And that just directly faces the construction of distress argument. So it's like in the Bible of the mainstream view, it looks like there's this parenthetical allegiance to a pretty compelling worry about the mainstream view, namely the construction of distress argument. Okay, sometimes in this debate, defenders of the mainstream view sometimes say, like, well, this construction of distress argument amounts to ignoring or trivializing genuine suffering, and we ought not do that. So sometimes disputants in this debate can, like, this sort of accusation is made. Right? Okay. The argument from treatment failure is just the converse of the argument from treatment success. It just says there's been a huge hunt from the pharmaceutical industry to find effective interventions, and that hunt has largely been a failure. And it's probably not a case in which like absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I mean, it's probably the case that given how hard scientists and pharmaceutical companies have been searching for an effective intervention, given like decade after decade of failure, it's probably the case that that failure is not merely transient. And incidentally, so like Sana Yukla is here in the conference with us, and she's written a nice paper on the case of flibanserin, which I recommend to you. Okay. The conflict of interest argument. So many critics, like especially kind of journalistic critics, like to point out that in the development of the disease category, there were like, these conferences that were paid for by pharmaceutical industry. The people who were invited were kind of cherry picked among like physicians who were friendly to big pharma, like Goldstein, who owned the Berman sisters. And there's just like too close a relationship between the people who were developing the disease category and the people who stood to make money from treating the disease category. And that there's something rhetorically persuasive about that, although it's inconclusive because many diseases are like this, and many diseases that we think are uncontroversially diseases like HIV, breast cancer, and depression. So there's something kind of persuasive about it, but ultimately it's not so convincing. And the harms argument is related to the argument from treatment failure. It just says medicalizing FSD comes with harms. So one straightforward harm are the harms of the interventions themselves. So, for example, versions of testosterone intervention were rejected by the FDA because it looked like trials were suggesting that testosterone as a treatment for FSD just came along with harms that were too big. And for the FDA to reject a treatment on those grounds is, says something. And same with flibanserin. So flibanserin, for example, this is the drug that Sana wrote her article about. It's like the main drug that's now on the market for FSD. It's not very useful, but it involves it has a bunch of side effects. And for example, like you're not allowed to drink alcohol when you're taking flibanserin, which if you think about it, like it's a drug for low sexual desire. If you're not allowed to drink alcohol, there's a big contraindication there. Okay. So we've got these two views with a bunch of arguments. And when we dive into the arguments on both sides, most of them are not so compelling. I'm going to spend just the next few minutes zooming out a bit. The two views are committed to different theories about the etiology of female sexual desire. So the mainstream view is committed to thinking about the etiology of sexual desire in biological terms, and the critical view is committed to thinking about etiology in social terms. Sometimes defenders of the critical view like to say, look, we really need to be attending to the broader context in which people's sexuality is placed. So we saw this in like McKinnon and many others. So for example, here's John Bancroft, the former director of the Kinsey Institute. The danger, quote, the danger of portraying sexual difficulties as a dysfunction is that it is likely to encourage doctors to prescribe drugs to change sexual function when the attention should be paid to other aspects of the woman's life, namely maybe an abusive or harmful relationship, or a stressful job, or like all sorts of social contexts that might be better changed than simply taking a pill. Now, of course, there's something really persuasive about this, but again, I think it's worth putting that kind of argument into a broader context of medicine and asking, how compelling is this argument in general? So imagine like I'm riding my bike to work in Cambridge, like back when I actually had to show up in my office. And I get hit by a car, and I'm now on the side of the road bleeding. And somebody comes along and says, oh, like the reason why you're sitting on the side of the road bleeding is like your arteries punctured. So they just cite this like proximal cause of the reason why there's like blood on the sidewalk. And somebody else says, well, yeah, but I mean, back up a bit. His artery is punctured because he was hit by that red car. That car just drove too close to him. Okay, so now we've got like a slightly more distal cause. And then somebody comes along and says, well, but the reason why that car hit him is because the streets in Cambridge are so narrow. You know, they were basically came out of the Middle Ages. And so there's too many cars on the streets. The streets are too narrow. The cars are driving too fast. And so it's really like, we have to put this person's cycling accident into the broader context of like the civic infrastructure of Cambridge. And when we start thinking in those terms, we get to a point in which things get a little bit absurd, right? So I'm sitting there on the side of the road bleeding, and really what I want is my blood staunched. And then later we can go to city council and ask for the streets to be widened. So I think what's happening, so here's an example of this in this particular debate. So this is an insightful article speaking about the kind of development and history of FSD. And the claim is, when we're thinking about particular cases of FSD, it seems like the big problem here is a lack of education rather than something aberrant about the woman. What kind of education? Like education about how to actually enjoy sex and not just like the female's education, but also like her partner's education. And so it's not a problem with the intrinsic biology of the person, but rather her context, including education, not just her education, but people around her. Okay, yeah, that's true, but actually that's true about so many medical problems. So like untreated Lyme disease, for example, or poor management of diabetes, or I mean, like suppose we go skiing and we don't know the difference between like what a black diamond is supposed to signify and what like a green, whatever it is, a green circle is supposed to signify. A green circle is this like easy ski run. A black diamond is a really hard ski run, and I'm just poorly educated. And so I don't know the difference between the two, and I ski down the black ski run and I hurt my back. It's totally implausible to think that my back injury is not a genuine disease simply because it arose out of this context in which I was poorly educated about ski runs. No, my injured back is still, it's a genuine medical problem. Okay. So this is sort of how I'm thinking about the difference between the mainstream view and the critical view. The mainstream view, of course, recognizes that there are distal causes. The mainstream view, of course, knows that there are, social and political and relationship factors involved in sexual dysfunction, but they focus on the importance of proximal causes. And the critical view seems to focus on the distal causes, like the broader social context. Now, I think maybe what's happening here is a dispute about where the best targets of intervention are. So I think maybe the critical view has in mind that it's the distal causes which are better targets for intervention rather than the proximal causes. So here is a causal graph of the etiology of depression, just to kind of give an example. And the nodes in this causal graph are themselves like really complicated social phenomena, like whether or not a person's ever been divorced. And so this is a kind of causal graph appealing to what we can consider as distal causes, right? Like whether or not a person has ever had lifetime trauma, or whether or not a person's ever been divorced. But of course, scientists also articulate these like mechanistic models about the etiology of depression. And sometimes they build in these life event models, like this particular graph. So stressful life is a node in the causal graph, and that's supposed to influence various kinds of mechanistic causes. And arguably, for all complex higher order behavioral traits, the etiology is this extremely complex causal nexus, which can be described at many different physical scales, from the biochemical to the social. And that's true for depression. That's probably true for a cycling accident. I mean, maybe the fact that the driver of the red car got too close to me can be described in biochemical terms. And the question is just, where's the best target for our interventions? So when there's this dispute between the mainstream view and the critical view, I think we can conceive of that dispute as a dispute involving talking past each other. So presumably all parties to the dispute would agree that for complex behavioral traits like sexual desire, the etiological causal nexus is this massively complex and multi-scale causal network. And then the question is just, on where in that causal nexus should we be targeting our interventions? The mainstream view says the proximal causes, like the hormone imbalances or whatever. And the critical view says the distal causes, like stressful relationships or abusive relationships. So I think that suggests a kind of pragmatic approach to the dispute, which says, look, rather than ask, is this a genuine disease or not, ask where in the complex etiological nexus can we effectively intervene? So that raises just this question about effectiveness of interventions. This is a graph. This is about testosterone patches, showing that like the best trials on the effectiveness of testosterone patches didn't help females very much. On average, they increased the number of like sexually satisfying episodes per month by about 1. And that's true also for flubencerin. So these numbers are like pretty consistent among different trials of different pharmaceutical interventions. And if we contrast that with like just male sexual dysfunction, it's a huge contrast. So it would seem strange to me to have a debate about the genuine disease status of erectile dysfunction. So for example, imagine Sergey, and incidentally, the DSM description of male sexual dysfunction also has the same kind of proviso, basically a diagnostic exclusion criterion, as the female category does. So actually, I went too quickly. I'm sorry, I didn't describe this, but for both the male and the female sexual dysfunction diseases, the low libido diseases, there's a diagnostic exclusion criterion which says if the person is in an abusive relationship, like if their symptoms are better described as being a result of their relationship context, then probably you shouldn't make a diagnosis, but rather their symptoms are best explained by. So another kind of curious proviso by the DSM, which is kind of handing a big argument over to the critical view. Nevertheless, imagine a token case for erectile dysfunction. Like Sergey goes to his physician and says, yeah, so I'm having problems in the bedroom. And the physician asks a few questions, and it turns out that Sergey's in an unhappy relationship. It's kind of abusive. Sergey's erectile dysfunction is probably best explained by the difficult relationship. But the physician knows that Viagra would help. It seems to me a bit fussy to ask, is Sergey's condition a genuine disease or not? Of course, it's not fussy to ask, maybe Sergey should end the relationship. So there's this like ethical question underlying this dispute. But I don't think that ethical question is very closely aligned to the ontological question, does Sergey have a genuine disease or not? Arguably, the difference is just how effective the intervention is. And maybe for that reason, basically the effectiveness of drugs like Viagra with relatively minimal harmful effects, some healthcare jurisdictions are just deciding like, you don't even need a prescription for Viagra anymore. It's just not the kind of thing that we should have as physicians being gatekeepers of, which itself, I think, is a kind of pragmatic argument that suggests that the whole debate about whether or not this condition is a genuine disease or not is misguided in certain contexts in which there's like this really like wildly effective intervention. So I think that the converse holds for the case of female sexual dysfunction. So basically, this appeal to the causal nexus, the causal etiology of the condition, and asking where in that causal etiology can we intervene at all. So in the case of erectile dysfunction, there's this causal bottleneck for which these interventions like Viagra can target. But in the causal etiology of female sexual dysfunction, at the very least until today, we haven't found such a causal lever. That suggests that probably we ought to be really cautious about diagnosing and certainly treating token instances, precisely because we haven't found that lever yet. If we found such a lever, then maybe we could start to conceive of the condition as a genuine disease, although there would still be these underlying ethical questions, like what about the kind of broader worries about reifying a condition as a disease, and what about taking away the motive for positive change in a person's life via this kind of pharmaceutical intervention. So in short, what I want to suggest is that the mainstream view and the critical view have been, to a certain degree, talking past each other. The talking past can be characterized in these like causal etiological terms. And the way to get that talking past each other to be resolved is to think in these pragmatic terms about where the causal levers are that we can intervene on. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I would again ask you to use the participants, go to participants, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom. And then on the right, click on raise hand. If you have a question, you can alternatively, you can also use the chat. I don't see any hands raised as of now. So, okay, Elisabetta, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Hi, sorry, I was trying to unmute my, okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Hi, Jacob. Thank you for the terrific talk. And I'm Elisabetta from Bologna. And my question, I mean, I'm really sympathetic to the whole conclusion about female sexual desire disorder or something. But I have a question on the final suggestion. So, so if you think that the main question should be how effective the intervention is, or what is the best place to locate the intervention, and sometimes in order to have an answer to that question, you have, for example, to run RCTs or experiments with pharmaceutical companies and things like that. And if that is the case, then you have to have the condition included in a nosology, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to. So my question is, in order to measure the effectiveness of intervention, you have to be able to test medically the interventions, and that's why sometimes it is useful to insert some condition into a nosology.
Yeah, actually, your comment is interesting, and it raises a few points. So one is, of course, you're right that to run a trial, you need a population of subjects for whom you're going to run the trial on, and so therefore you need some kind of inclusion and exclusion criterion. And so I take your point. Yeah. Now that exclusion criteria might be something really tentative, like people who are suffering from the following symptoms, right? So we could be sort of agnostic about what the causes of those symptoms are, or be agnostic about whether or not those symptoms reflect some genuine disease. But we could just say like anybody who's suffering from these like strictly empirical, and those 6 symptoms that define FSD are kind of empirical, right? You can just ask, like, have you been? And so yeah, I'm okay with that. And then the other thing that your comment raises, which I haven't thought much about, but it's an interesting one, is so insofar as one were persuaded by my line that really what matters is effectiveness, and it sometimes might be the case that targeting on a distal causal node is more effective than targeting a proximal causal node. Like sometimes just ending an abusive relationship will be more effective than taking a pill, right? But that's an intervention. And how do we know that that intervention is, in fact, going to be effective, at least for this particular person, if not for a class of people? And of course, that's not the kind of thing that we can run an RCT on, right? So, and so this raises this whole debate about the like strictures of evidence-based medicine and the criticisms of evidence-based medicine. Like evidence-based medicine is great for testing pharmaceuticals, but of course it's not great for testing the effectiveness of ending abusive relationships. And so arguably that's an argument against the strictures of evidence-based medicine for some kinds of interventions.
Right? Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, any other questions? You can, before you make up your mind, I do have a couple of them. So, no, please, Breeze, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. Okay.
Right. Oh, he doesn't have a mic, but
yeah.
On the chat.
Great.
Is the issue for the new view a question of distality? I guess they would also oppose use pills to deal with the psychological problems. Okay, I think I understand the question. So, right. I think that, you know, some proponents of the new view would say that the distress is just best managed by targeting distal causes like abusive relationships or bad education. So insofar as there's a psychological problem, namely distress, or do you mean just for other disease categories entirely, like depression or something like that? I'm not sure that the new view has any kind of commitments to other psychiatric diseases, but insofar as there's a psychological problem that is tied to sexual dysfunctions, like namely the distress component of the disease, then presumably their view is just that distress will be best managed by social interventions rather than pharmaceutical interventions.
Well, Breeze, if you have a follow-up, you're welcome to use the chat again. And okay, good. And so I would like to ask you a few of the, oh, well, Peter, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for a lecture. I'm not a philosopher, so maybe I don't get it, but I don't quite understand your argument against the argument for appetite, because as you say, hunger is not a disease, of course, but too big appetite is a symptom of several genetic disorders. And on the other end of the spectrum, very low appetite is syndrome of several diseases. So could you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I find it persuasive to think that sexual desire is like an appetite, right? I mean, there's something appetitive about sexual desire in general. Of course, there's a very psychological component to sexual desire, but there's also a psychological component to hunger. I mean, some people modulate their hunger via psychological means, and some people have a hunger for foie gras, and that bizarre perversion must be psychological. And so just having a psychological component to an appetite doesn't mean that some appetite is not an appetite. So I'm okay with that. So sexual desire is appetitive in the sense that you have some urge for some like event or activity which has both a biological and a psychological component to it, like hunger. But what does that tell us? I mean, isn't like rock climbing like that, or dancing in like a nightclub? So there's some physical basis and there's some psychological basis to desire some event or activity, and that can be modulated via pharmaceutical means. Like if you just drink alcohol, for example, you might have more fun dancing, but that doesn't mean that like any of those features when taken together imply that some condition is a disease, right? Like the desire to dance on a dance floor.
Well, that's a great answer. Maybe I'm just not sure if it's a good analogy. Maybe I'm too much in biology to understand this kind of reasoning. But even with dancing, if you have uncontrolled movements caused by epilepsy, for example, or you have problem to coordinate your movements because of dementia or something, it can be. I understand there are many social causes. Of course, it's not disease if you. Well, it's hard to put the right threshold, what is and what it is not disease. But I mean, you can always have some biological cause which make you unable to do something which we normally think is only social or learned. So is maybe, well, sorry.
No, I'm on board with what you're saying. So I think maybe you're making a gesture towards this like distress component, right? So we can imagine somebody who has this like uncontrollable urge to dance on the dance floor, and or maybe somebody who is so shy they don't want to dance, even though they think that their life would be a lot better if they were dancing, and their friends keep pressuring them, and they're like sad that they can't get on the dance floor. Once they have a couple of alcoholic drinks, then they're ready to go. And so it looks like there's this condition which they're not able to do, and they really want to do it, and the inability for them to do it is causing them some distress, and then there can be some exogenous intervention which helps them. And so maybe the issue here is one of distress. And so if it were the case that low sexual desire, were fundamentally tied to this like form of distress, which is uncontroversially a harm, then we're more in the ballpark of thinking that the condition is a genuine disease. And I think that's why a lot of the debate ends up hinging on the nature of that harm, rather than the nature of the physical state. Yeah. Thank you.
So we started a little bit late, so I think I can just squeeze my own questions. So first, again, I was about to mention that sort of I'm not I'm rather ignorant about this topic, so this is really just sort of trying to wrap my head around this. So I assume that that this is recognized as a medical condition because there are women going to the clinic and asking for help, right? So I guess the question is then, to what extent this is recognized as a genuine issue concerning the life of many women? Is there a statistic?
Yeah, there are statistics. So on the first point, though, I would think like a historian of science might offer a much more nuanced answer than I would on that first point. So like the theoretical development of the categories has a kind of itself an impact on the way people think about whether or not they themselves are satisfied or normal or happy, right? So like maybe in a kind of Ian Hacking looping effect style. So it's not obvious that the motive force for the construction of the disease category is just from patient up, right? So I would think it's much more complicated than that. And there are a lot of statistics on how widespread the phenomenon is. Those statistics themselves are controversial. So one study, for example, argued that 43% of women suffer from FSD, 43%. And what critics said is actually what that 43% was comprised of was something like any surveyed female who answered yes to one of the different kinds of symptoms, not to like the diagnostic criterion itself. Some sex therapists will say that like the vast majority of complaints that they're getting in their clinic are low libido from either males or females. And more journalistically, there have been these like kind of articles that look at these trials that were testing both testosterone and flibanserin. And these trials ended up getting this like huge amount of subject volunteers and then media attention because people really, really wanted an effective intervention for FSD. So by all accounts, it's a widespread problem, though just how widespread and how severe is controversial.
So, thanks. And my other question is sort of, let's assume that this disorder is no longer recognized as such. So it's no longer recognized as a disease or disorder, but rather reconceptualized as a state that can be enhanced by taking some stimulants. So in that case, of course, it would depend on the kind of drugs, on the nature of the drug, and how safe it is. So in case of testosterone, this would be questionable, of course. And I assume for the drug that's been approved, this could also raise some eyebrows. So again, let's think that there is some sort of way to induce higher sexual desire while having negligible side effects. So in that case, there is sort of would be a way for the pharmaceutical business to still sort of, push some drugs on the market, even though it would no longer be recognized as a disease to be treated. So something perhaps of the, how Viagra is being used, perhaps. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it might be the case that, and probably would be the case, given how powerful the pharmaceutical industry is, it would probably be the case that it would still be the pharmaceutical industry that was doing the manufacturing and the controlling and the distribution. Although arguably, if the substance were so effective and so safe, then, if we're talking about just some, like, I don't know, it's like something as safe as adding like salt to your food, then it's a little bit hard to see why we would be involved in the business of, including the pharmaceutical industry and just handing them all the profit for that. But as a descriptive matter of fact, that's probably true that they would still be involved. And certainly that's, as you said, that's the case with Viagra. Yeah. So I don't have that's a kind of big social political question that I don't have any kind of well worked out view on. Yeah.
Thanks. We've just run out of time, so thank you again, Jacob.
Thank you very much, yeah.
Virtual clap again.